Welcome everybody. Welcome to Progressly's webinar, Bridging the Gap Between People, Process and Performance. My name is Derek Myers. I'm going to be our compere or host for this session. I'd like to start off perhaps with a few house rules, as it were. You guys are all on mute to begin with, and probably going to stay that way. If you've got questions, and please do ask questions, can you please submit them via the Q&A chat box? We're going to address those at the end. If you've got any audio issues, obviously, please let us know, and again through the chat box, and we'll try and resolve them at that point. As I said, my name is Derek Myers. I work for a company called Structured Talent. I recently authored a paper for Progressly, really looking into the implications of operational performance management. I've been around this space for a very long time. Deep competence around BPM, workflow, all those sorts of things, but also around methods of change and engagement and what have you. Maybe I'm just going to introduce our panelists. They're going to introduce themselves, and then we're going to get to a pretty free-flowing discussion. So, Adam, why don't I let you leap into the fray?
Thanks, Derek. So my name's Adam Lomas. I'm currently working in Shell. I have been there for the last 10 years. I've had the privilege of working for Shell and our partners across 5 different countries. Initially, in my early part of my career, I was focused on capital projects execution. More recently, I've moved into corporate strategy, change programs, and implementation, and the more commercial space, still very much tied to capital project and process development. I've been fortunate enough to work alongside with Progressly in some of this thinking for the last couple of years, and have implemented some quite large changes across the Shell organisation as it relates to process changes and other elements like that. It's enough for me for the time being. I'll pass you across to Eric.
Hello, my name is Eric Janvier. I'm, as you see, a Managing Director of Accenture, specializing in upstream oil and gas. Actually, Accenture acquired Schlumberger Business Consulting, which I co-founded 15 years ago. And we were specializing in helping oil and gas clients or suppliers in their efforts to improve strategy, of course, also organization and performance improvement, which did lead to a lot of discussions around processes, people, and performance, as you can imagine.
And I am Nick Candido. First off, thanks to Derek for hosting this, Adam for your support over the last couple of years, and Eric for joining us. My background is about 10 years in enterprise technologies, thinking first about the pharmaceutical space, and then getting really passionate about how to think about hosted technologies, especially tied to operations. So 2 companies on the East Coast in Boston, second company out here in Silicon Valley, where the company that brought me out here was acquired by Salesforce.com, which is one of the pioneers in how to think about hosted solutions and connected devices. So I'm one of the founders of Progressly, and basically what we kind of came to think of was the mission that we're driving is helping our customers transform the way that they do business, and a big part of that is the digital transformation that we'll dive into here. So the 2 industries that we've been particularly excited about, energy and utilities, and also transportation. And I was fortunate this year to be named one of Forbes 30 under 30 in enterprise technology.
Thanks for that, Nick. Let's maybe go to our first slide, and just to help the audience understand a little bit, the slides that we've got, really half a dozen or so, are these sorts of things for talking points for the panelists here to discuss what's going on. Maybe it's as I said, a free-flowing conversation. Maybe I could just ask, I don't know, Adam, to sort of kick things off with a little discussion about what he sees going on within this industry and the challenges that we've got to deal with when we start trying to rethink operations.
Yeah, sure, no worries. Since joining the industry, I've noticed over the last decade or so the increasing complexity, not only from the technical challenges we're trying to solve through the exploration, discovery and production of hydrocarbon, and then further down into the value chains in downstream and distribution, but also in the non-technical arenas with the fallout of incidents such as Macondo, which has rightly so increased the focus on some of the HSE regulations. The environments that we're working in are no longer politically stable, and so it makes it a much more challenging environment to work in. So when that becomes more complex, if you add in more complexity of process and you continue to build this patchwork of process, you just increase all of that element of complexity. And so we're left with a very complex environment that could really do with a bit of a look at. Add to that the current cycles we're in of the workforce developing, trying to move from paper to digital, as you can see on the slides here. There are a lot of changes within the technology offerings out there that could help simplify this, but could equally add to the complexity. So I think one of the challenges that we're looking at is to address some of these things without increasing the complexity of our industry.
Eric, did you have a view on this as well?
Yeah, I think all these trends, have been extremely pregnant, and you would see, or you were seeing one of the consequences, which was that the costs were escalating very quickly, too quickly actually to be sustainable until very recently. And a lot of that was due to laying standards over standards, processes over processes, and layers over layers in the organizations. Now, obviously, all the cycles go back and forth. After a few years of reinforcing the central functions and technical disciplines with the lower cost of oil, everybody's been delayering and simplifying and especially decentralizing decisions to the assets. So we're sort of back to the 80s in that sense. But the challenge to get the various technical disciplines interacting with various managers in a number of widely dispersed locations remains. And I think in a few years, people will realize that the move to assets is not the final solution either, and they have to find new ways to get their teams to work together.
I suppose part of that is a sort of organizational challenge of managing the matrix almost of, to your point, assets versus specialist knowledge areas and what have you. The regulation that's happening, that has happened, things like Macondo and what have you coming along, you think that's under control or just getting worse? Eric, I'll throw that back at you.
The regulations in themselves have not changed that much. Since a few accidents in North Sea that actually were worse than Macondo in terms of human losses, all the authorities, at least in the European countries, have tried as much as they could to impose safety and impose good practices. The US may have been a bit different for a while, but I think it's more the sensitivity of the companies themselves. Now that the Macondo event has proven that a succession of operational mistakes can cost $60 billion, everybody knows that the stake or the life of their company is at stake here, and you can't really just cross your fingers and pray for things to go well.
So clearly processes have got a role to play. Nick, I just want to try and bring you into the conversation a bit here. Do you want to talk a little bit to this right-hand column here, the workforce, the paper to digital, cloud, mobility aspects?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we heard pretty often when we were originally thinking about what type of industries we should look to support was this notion of the big crew change. And I think this is something that's been discussed at length across energy and utilities as an industry, but it also applies across several other industries where there's this notion of a workforce that's coming up on retirement. And succession planning is something that has to be thought through just to think about defensibility for the industry as a whole. And when we engaged in these conversations early on, there were IT executives who were frustrated with the amount that had been invested in technologies that hadn't been adopted by this prior generation. So it was almost, a force multiplier around the problem that they had at hand, where not only did they have to figure out how to get information out of people's heads now that there was a lot of work that was being done that complies more to a traditional knowledge workers type mindset, but there also has to be a tool that they can take on that makes it really easy for people to do their job, but also creates this defensibility that they were looking for. So I would say that was the way we were brought into the conversation from an IT and executive perspective. But then as we came to dig into the industry a little bit more and think about how we want to drive solutions that have high engagement because they have high end user utility, we spend a lot of time kind of thinking through the things that are either in-house built tools, where there's multiple different ones that are being managed at different site locations. So if you think about the operations side within oil and gas, but there's also a ton of work that's still done on paper. And not only does that make it very hard to think about how do you scale information, how do you make things real time, how do you make it so you can be more predictable around some of the vulnerabilities that you might have as an organization, but it's actually worse for the people who are actually doing the work on paper. So we've kind of came to understand this entire problem full circle, but there was a macro trend known as the big crew change that got us in the door, and then as we got outside of the building and looked at how technology is actually being utilized, the reason why it's not being used in the way that helps the business line is because it has to be a mobile offline solution that's as easy to use as paper. And I think that's something that you have to think very deliberately about as a solutions provider.
And of course, this last point on the left, this patchwork quilt of systems and processes. When we were planning this call, I used the phrase about, it was a blog I saw the other day, but it was talking about grade 2 listed banks, to the point where the bank is so afraid of changing any systems because so many things rely on it that it's almost like the building is set in concrete, but we want to try and change the way in which we service it and help people do things. I think that's going on here as well. Let's skip on because my job is to try and keep us on time. Is there anything else, Adam, that you want to add to this conversation so far, or?
That's fine. Yep.
Okay. So our second slide here is this notion of the challenges that you start coming up against when you're trying to streamline operations and reinvent yourself, transform organizations. Eric, that's pretty much in the wheelhouse of Accenture, isn't it, doing all those sorts of things?
Yes, I would think so as well. Do you hear me? Yes?
Yeah, we hear you fine.
Okay, good. Yeah, obviously, we're not the only ones doing that, but it's a large part of our work, and to be honest, of our clients' work as well. It's not only external service companies who work at that. The oil and gas industry here is probably more complex than a lot of the others I've seen. Again, you have a lot of organizational boundaries because most majors operate in 100 different countries, including jungles, deserts, and everything. And this industry being highly technical, there are lots of technical functions that all believe that they hold a single version of the truth. So in most of the changes I've been invited to help at clients, actually getting the communication and the organization through is a huge challenge. You have to take into account that the equivalent in the upstream oil and gas of the plant engineer is sitting, for instance, in Aberdeen onshore, but the workers and operators he's trying to drive are actually living 150 kilometers offshore, and you can't reach them without taking a helicopter. So for a long time, these guys used to actually unplug anything they didn't like and carry on doing things like they used to. Now it's changing, but still the coordination and the data collection takes a huge amount of time, whether from the management onshore or from the operators offshore. Actually, a big problem we had in North Sea was that except a few small independents who had kept their operations very nimble, most of the effort was internally focused, and actually very little was focused on delivering operational impact, if you want. That's changing now because, again, with the oil price dropping from 100 to 50, people have lost a lot on simplifying organizations. But still, there's a lot to be gained, and I've seen other industries that are a lot leaner.
And so, Adam, just bringing in a sort of Shell perspective here, I mean, your organization is almost famous for having a large number of business units that need to collaborate. And how do you do this sort of change when you're trying to span those organizational boundaries?
Yeah, one of the complexities of these sort of changes is that whenever you focus on operation and processes, you're talking in the space of how do you do your day job. And I think one of the challenges is really getting people out of that how space and lifting them a bit higher into the why questions. Why are we doing this? What are we doing it for? What is the driver? It's there, all within the context of the strategy that you're looking to deliver against. I see time and time again conversations around about process and operational performance, talking around how you actually do it without that context around it that allows people to make better decisions. Because unless you lift yourself up and out of the detail, if you dare say it that way, you have a difficulty in going through the simplification process, which will then allow the elements that you can see on here of trying to get that balance back between prescription and empowerment. So one of the challenges and one of the things that's been introduced as a result of operating in 100 countries is, well, Shell doesn't, but as Eric mentioned, in jungles and deserts and other places like that, is that many industries, organizations rather, have tried to put in place controls and processes to account for every possible eventuality. So they're trying to manage complexity by adding in more complexity, and they get stuck in a vicious cycle down in solving the how question rather than getting themselves back up and asking that why question. If that can be done more systematically, that will help you design processes that support people, because at the end of the day it's the people that deliver the outcomes, not the processes. But they need to be supported by processes that are simple, tailored for the objective that they're seeking. So unless you define that outcome, doing this streamlining process and improvement processes is very, very difficult.
That's a sort of cultural thing as much as anything else, isn't it?
Absolutely,
I mean,
absolutely.
The engineers amongst us like to say, no, hold on, let's just make sure that it works exactly like this. And yet others need to take part in coming up with those solutions.
Absolutely, and I'm not saying the checklists and the detailed processes don't have a place, but I think it's very important that you consciously choose why you're doing that and be mindful of the balance between this prescription, which takes away in some cases empowerment, and the freedom of individuals to act.
Eric,
sorry, Eric.
But you're also, yeah, no, absolutely no problem. You're also right to say it's cultural, and I've seen some what we call in oil and gas small independents, so much smaller companies with a very different approach to it, saying, all these processes and everything, it muddles accountability, it slows decision making, and in the end, it's always obsolete anyway. So we choose the right people with the right skills, then we make them accountable, and they have to deliver, and it's their job to find a way to do it. And I think, obviously, everybody cannot do that, but the fact that oil and gas companies have grown a lot in the last 20 years, I mean, if you look at Shell, Exxon, their size is nowhere close to what it was 20 years ago, and the operations themselves have become more and more complex means that if you don't take a particular care about simplifying your organization, you end up with meetings with 12 people to take any decision, handbooks of procedures with thousands of pages, and nobody knows in the end who's taking the decision, and this has a huge cost. And I think we can learn from some more nimble organizations that have put more emphasis on people and less emphasis on process, if you want.
One of the reasons I mentioned culture, I suppose I wanted to share a situation that I was involved with. When I was within Forrester, it was leading a sort of continuous improvement group in one of the major oil and gas companies. And it was in the UK here. And, you would think that changing shift on an oil rig is something that is pretty standard. And yet, when push comes to shove, you find that the culture was, well, if those guys invented it, we're not doing it. Talking about one rig that's looking at another one that's saying, well, if you invented it, we're not doing it. So that's that's a sort of almost a tribal thing that starts to happen when you get people working together, and it takes a very, I think maybe this is the point you were making, Eric, takes a very strong set of leaders to overcome some of those challenges that have emerged over years, many years, tens of years. Nick, have you got anything that you want to add to this conversation that we're having here?
Absolutely. One of the conversations that we try to lean into pretty early into a relationship with any one of our future customers is how to think about an adoption model on technology that actually drives empowerment. And if you think about a lot of the solutions that have been implemented today, it's this top-down adoption model. So we're going to implement this, and this is what everyone's going to use, and from there, life goes on. And what actually turns out is the adoption model that's most impactful for an industry that is now thinking more about empowerment and thinking about how do you focus more on people so that they can make the right decisions in compliance with your overall why and strategy, like Adam had mentioned. But the adoption model that starts with the people who actually can define these processes, where there might be additional complexity based on where they are or the line of business or an optimization that they're going to want to implement themselves, makes it so much easier to eventually drive a dialogue where you have high engagement, and then you're thinking about how does that align with kind of the IT agenda. So one of the things that kind of plays out is getting people on the product right away evaluates exactly how impactful people can be once they're actually empowered, and then we start to talk through things like as we move up to kind of the corporate side of the business, what are some of the hidden costs that go into some of these solutions that have been implemented in a top-down way, right? And that's where we typically start talking about what's the difference between an on-premise solution and a hosted solution, and costs might not always be the costs of the software. It might be the ongoing customization or training or implementation or IT time that actually has to be serviced to the business team so that they can do our job. So I think when we start with that bottoms-up type mindset, being mindful of a lot of the things that Eric had mentioned with some of the independent companies, and Adam and Shell, I think, have done a phenomenal job of being mindful of as a massive organization, is eventually what you want is alignment between the business and people who make decisions on technologies. And on the business side, it has to be easy to use and it has to be collaborative. It has to be easy for them to connect to the people that they have to be working with on an ongoing basis. And then when you talk to IT, we want to be the secure hosted provider for your operations, right? And we think very deliberately about what do we do to empower your line of business? How do we plug into a system that's inherently secure? And we've kind of thought about identity integrations in a way where, no secret there that most of the companies within the industries that we target are Microsoft shops, right? And how Active Directory has been set up to manage access of people all across the organization is something that we carry over into the permission structure that we have within Progressive. So, add value on the people who use the product day to day and understand how to drive a conversation where there's alignment and there's unification around systems that need to be in place that ultimately drive a higher ROI, which means people use the product to do exactly what they need to on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, just picking up on that a little bit there, I think it's important what you touch on is once you've actually gone through a process of simplification and refining your processes to a point in which they're designed to deliver value against the strategy you're looking for, you need people to interact with them and use them. And I think something like a Progressly, which is user-friendly, easy to interact with, and visually appealing, will really help deliver some of that value through the process that you've designed. And hopefully, if you do get that interaction and that uptake on the level of process, you can further reduce your number of processes and your number of controls and checks, because people are actually integrating and bringing it all together.
I suppose there's also an aspect of maybe Adam, you were touching on this before, but there's a sort of a process architecture element to this, and maybe that's what you mean by simplification. You know, one of the real problems with lots of process change initiatives is that they tend to be always based on this drill-down notion of a process, that I can break a task into subtasks, and everything's sort of contained within. When really, I suppose it's really it's a question often of almost componentizing parts of those processes so that you can reuse them and access them sort of elsewhere. But you know, I think, you know, we could probably carry on this for some time. Let's move on and just see how our conversation develops. We want to talk a little bit about this notion of operational performance management and what that really means. And maybe, Nick, do you want to sort of take a stab at that first and then sort of toss it to Adam and Eric and see how we get on?
Absolutely. So there's essentially three big differentiators that we think about, and it might actually make sense to start with what was the evolution of operational performance management as a category. So operational performance management is a category that was defined in the 90s for manufacturing. And really what it's about is keeping multiple different cross-functional units in alignment to achieve core objectives. But the difference between manufacturing and a lot of the work that gets done today is when you're producing a physical good, it's very easy to know if you're at the right outcome, right? And how do you keep a lot of those people in alignment towards that physical good, right? If something's missing, you're gonna be able to catch that pretty quickly, and then kind of go back and figure out how you fix that from a quality or compliance standpoint. And what we notice is that this operational performance problem is something that still exists today in a lot of organizations that have workers who are in multiple different time zones, in distributed teams. And how do you think about really aligning people who need to be able to make decisions but do repeatable work with a predictable outcome when it's not always tied to just the physical good that you're delivering on? So with Progressly, we're the first cloud-based operational performance management solution. In the first pillar is a cloud-based system, and we are hosted. And the two major advantages there are that we're device agnostic. We can make it phenomenally easy for people who need to use their phones to do the work, to pull it out and get productive. That provides particular leverage when you think about contractors or part-time employees. Think a turnaround cycle within refineries within this industry, and also offline support. So if you're an exploration and production company and a lot of your business isn't going to be connected day to day, how can they continue to do their job where the right data gets to the right people? The second thing is this notion of really making a self-service system. So it can be managed, provisioned, and authorized by IT, but a line of business person can go in and go ahead and make the decisions that they want to make to improve anything that they're doing within Progressly as a system. And it kind of reminds me of your last point there, Derek, where if you do the drill down to subtasks, you're doing that as an outsider. And really a lot of the iteration that happens on an ongoing basis is meant to be managed by the business units and happens naturally today without a digital representation. And then the third thing is real time, right? So when it's a connected system, as soon as you get connected, information gets to the people who need it. It's integrated with other systems that we have. It's discoverable for them when they need to find the things that they have to do on an ongoing basis. And one of the big things we're super excited about is insights. So making it so real-time data collection can actually drive real-time notifications, or daily if you want to understand the massive amount of data that's come in where you want to track outliers or see if you want to make any improvements. You don't need to do that on a monthly cycle anymore, which is the fastest we've seen it done with a lot of our customers. You can actually do that on a daily basis or even faster, depending on what your requirements are.
Adam, do you feel this operational performance management aspect of the visibility, this looking at the performance of how operations are going, is that a big thing for you and your organization?
Yeah, absolutely. Being able to understand what's going on, when and why, and make real-time decisions based on that information is important. One of the things to caution there is that obviously as soon as you have that visibility and you start measuring things, obviously you change the behaviours of the people that are working and interacting with the process. So it gets back to that whole change management consideration of what behaviours are you trying to drive, what are you trying to achieve, and what are the impacts and potential implications of making it so visible and transparent around the way people interact. Having said that, I do think it's very important to be able to measure things, because you get what you measure at the end of the day. So having that information is important, not only for decision making but also continuous improvement and learning abilities.
You sort of get what you measure. The old saying is, what you can't manage what you can't measure, but I think the nuance that you're touching on here is you will get what you measure. In other words, there may be all sorts of behaviours in there that you haven't planned for that is what you're going to get.
Absolutely. I mean, the unintended consequences of adding in controls and assurance and things is you sometimes change behaviours in the way that you didn't intend or don't want it to happen that way. And that is one of the considerations when I've seen process rollouts. I was in the military prior to joining Shell. The view of process rollout is it's a relatively straightforward thing. You roll it out, you do a bit of training, and people now know the new process. But it's not as simple as that. It's every time you do a change of this, it's a behavioural change program, and you can't change individuals. Ultimately, they change themselves. So if they don't want to do it, it doesn't matter how good the process is. So you need to be very mindful that every time you try and shape or change a process, that you need to focus heavily on the individuals and that change journey that they will all be going on, some quicker than others and some maybe not at all.
And in a way, we're touching on the sort of, I think it's the next slide where I'll be talking a little bit about this approach to co-creation and engaging folks into designing their future. Eric, have you got things you want to add to this part of the conversation around OPM? Are you there, Eric? You might be on mute. He's all quiet on the Western Front.
No, sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, no, I was saying I share Adam's view. There's a huge potential in this industry to improve the productivity. People try to refine the processes, but in the end, it's not enough. If you take two examples, offshore work, North Sea until recently, the average tool time of people you would send offshore was 3.5 hours. That is, you would send a crew to do some maintenance operation offshore. They would take the helicopter at 7 in the morning, fly back with the helicopter at 7 in the evening, and in between the actual productive time was 3.5 hours. I think they've improved that a bit, but there is a huge potential in better preparing jobs and tracking the execution. Same thing for the turnarounds. Turnarounds usually last 2-4 weeks. Most of them actually overrun by 2 weeks at least, with everything that it means in terms of contracting, in terms of hosting people offshore and so on. So again, most good practitioners now have a full-time team preparing the turnarounds in advance. So anything that can help mapping the processes with the people and then tracking how it works is extremely helpful. And unfortunately, most of that currently is done through meetings, daily briefings, which consume a lot of time and in the end provide only so much transparency. So I personally believe that each of the points on this slide are highly important and can really have a huge impact on productivity.
I mean, at the heart of this, though, isn't it sort of almost like the processes become the mechanisms of coordination and collaboration as well? That's part of the issue here, right?
One other
Yeah, well,
shift.
I mean,
Go ahead, Adam.
sorry?
Go ahead, Eric.
I was going to say the processors currently achieve that, but with a huge investment in consultants, in paperwork, and so on and so on. I think the challenge is to achieve the same, but almost real time, more customized to each operator, and with a better feedback, if you want, between the prescription and the reporting. Excuse me, Adam, I interrupted you.
No, this is Nick. One thing to add that I think probably seems like a subtle shift, but I think it's meaningful when you think about the overall trend that we're seeing here, is that the way that standards, policies, and procedures today are actually codified is typically in stagnant documents, right? So, you know, there's an artifact that you should be able to reference, and it's with the outcome in mind. In really actually thinking about what it takes for you to be able to make a process change that's going to impact both people and performance means it has to be something that's interactive enough where it can be assigned to the right person, which is typically data in to be able to start a process that you'd want to be able to follow. There's a communication component to the people that you need to be working with, assuming that there's multiple different stakeholders. And then there's also this notion of approvals and signatures, right? So how do you get to a finalized point where you know that it's been done the right way, which is then more predictable as a foundation for the way you want to do it next time. So I think there's kind of 2 degrees when you think about the platform shift. There are a lot of times where it's still paper. Digitizing to something that's just a Word document isn't necessarily solving the problem. Then there's a shift to the way that you actually need to think about a solution that makes it easier for the people to go through this journey in a predictable way.
I think that you're starting to touch on, you know, how do you get those standard operating procedures, take them from those codified sort of dead document sort of structure that you have, whether it is in a PDF that's printed out and bound, or even as an electronic document. You really want to be able to take those and start to use them to drive the way that work happens, that this is the mechanism for transferring context between different parties involved in the system. I'm just conscious we've been on this for a little while. I want to move us along. We've got a few minutes left, a few more slides to chew through here, and actually all cogent to this anyway. So maybe the question becomes, though, how do you enable the users themselves to solve their own process problems rather than feeling that they need heavy lifting from IT to you know, bless them in terms of what they're doing? I mean, Adam, you probably run into this quite a lot within Shell, yeah?
Yeah, so it's not. I mean, it's not only IT that a stakeholder in this journey for an individual process user. It's the organisation as a whole. The processes in an organisation like Shell are very much intertwined and dependent on each other. That making any change in one requires quite a large degree of consultation amongst others. So what might on paper seem like a simple activity of removing a step or changing a step on paper, in the culture that's created, not only in Shell but in some of the other larger organisations within the industry, is that it takes multiple people, sometimes tens of people, to approve any simple little change. So that empowerment for an individual to own and improve and tweak their own processes is a complex thing to get, particularly when you link it to some of the controls that are in place to protect or safeguard the business from bad outcomes, or the perception that the controls are in place to protect the business from bad outcomes. It's a pretty complicated thing. to try and empower individual users to solve their problems. Then that becomes much more of a cultural challenge than just a specific technology that would allow them to do it. Because I think from a technology perspective, those things exist already. But for me to go in and I've just reset the project management system within Shell and then rolled it out across the globe, that was an incredibly complex thing. And then if I had have locked myself in a room with 10 experts, I could have done it in a fraction of the time than we did. But bearing in mind it's a change journey, whenever you do these things, all of those process owners and different elements had to be engaged. Which we've now created a framework where people do have the ability to go in and own their own process and own their own outcomes on how they do things. But it's a very difficult change to go through, and it's more behavioural than it is actually system-based or technology-based, in my view.
Eric?
I think that, I mean, increasingly the oil and gas industry is catching some concepts from other industries like lean approaches and things like that. So the concept of empowering operators to find their own solutions is slowly creeping into the oil and gas industry. But you still have these two extremes, and I just finished working for a client to write one procedure again, one of these. It's about 20 pages and it took us 6 months. And I think it's not only getting all the right approvals, it's also getting enough traction from all the functions to ensure that it will be supported afterwards. So it's not only a validation, it's also making sure that enough people are behind it, that it will gain traction at the company level, because when you write these procedures, it always ends up being, the scope is global, if you want. Now, the other extreme, a Kaizen team or a lean workshop is going to take 5 people on a site and find a local solution to a local problem, which applying some fairly well-known techniques is actually very powerful. Unfortunately, it will not necessarily last, because it's difficult to transfer that new process, if you want, in the way to do things on a daily basis. I mean, it's not really transferable because it's usually kept local. So again, anything that can accelerate the first and leverage the second beyond the local experience is going to add value, I would say.
There's a couple of issues here, though, right? You're talking more about sort of general process change, but when you start potentially enabling, folks to do it for themselves on a system like Progressly, the IT folks are often sort of hold up their hands in horror that it's going to be another Lotus Notes scenario that before you know it, they're going to be locked into, a rapidly evolving multi-headed monster that they can't control. And I suppose my reason for putting this point here about governance and oversight was more around just trying to make sure that when you start chartering these sorts of change initiatives and start embracing these sorts of technology solutions, actually going through this little bit of governance and oversight, pain early on, involving compliance and risk and all those sorts of folks in where you're going with this and why you're going there, actually is going to help you get there a lot quicker in the long term. It might feel like it's a bit of a break on what you're doing, but certainly can make a big difference. I'm just going to try and move us on because I'm getting to sort of hurry up from the powers that be. Nick, did you have anything that you wanted to add here quickly?
So the term that we think is being championed across several solutions today is this notion of citizen development. And I think, per your point, Derek, there is the right way to approach this with the right partner, where you make sure that access and governance and how we think about that in the software world as permissions is given to those who you see as functional experts or people who you want to have the ability to make some of these changes. But the reality is that the representation of a system like Progressly is one-to-one to the way things work today, and the changes are made once a system has been put in place that's truly digital. So I think there's a bottleneck when you think about anything that's being done today in paper because the iteration speed is so much slower. And then you shouldn't need technical skills to be a person who can figure out how to run your line of business based on the expertise that you already have. And that notion of citizen development, when done the right way with the right permissioning, drives phenomenal empowerment across the business, which I think is ultimately what the right process is all about.
Yeah, and in the run-up to this, we talked about democratization of process. I suppose what I'm getting at here in terms of governance and oversight is if you are really trying to do this sort of thing in a large organization, a federated organization, there are forces at work that if you don't, get the ducks lined up in a row before you might have got an early successful 6-month project under your belt, but then, the champions of compliance or risk or something come along and close you down because they were not involved earlier on. And all I'm really saying here is that in getting those sort of folks involved in the charter for your centre of expertise that you might be setting up to support those democratized developers, it's time well spent is the point. Anyway, I'm going to move us on in a way because that in a way talks to this digital transformation with a purpose type initiative, and it is this business-led governance framework that tends to kill these things off if you're not careful. Obviously it's about engaging the folks that you work with and engaging them to industrialize the way in which they do things today rather than, we've got to go through a 9-man-year exercise to be able to come up with one standard way of operating. But it's about capturing those sorts of things. The final point on this slide here, this foolproof or fault tolerant, I just want to throw that to Adam if I can, just to maybe start there, Adam, and talk to anything on the slide. But I just want to get your angle on, obviously you don't want an engineer getting creative with stripping down a wellhead. On the other hand, there are things that go on where fault tolerant is quite good enough. Can you just talk to that a little bit in your experience in Shell?
Yeah, I mean, it all depends on the context you're operating in. If you're in a research and development environment where you want to fail fast to learn quickly, if you will, then you want to have a system or a series of processes that are fault tolerant. If you're in an operating refinery type environment where you want to make sure that the sequence of a series of valve turnings and other bits and pieces is done in the right way, then you want that to be foolproof, and you want a very different style of process. I think it's all important to understand what type of operation you're running and what type of outcome you're looking for to help you design and tailor the process to support it. And I think that goes even in the capital project environment. You have early parts of the project or even parts of execution where you're happy to be fault tolerant, but there's other parts where you're absolutely, when you're doing quite a major lift, when you're lifting your topside on top of your jacket, you don't want that to fail. So you want that to be completely foolproof. So I think understanding what you're trying to achieve and the context you're in, and whether you're in an operational mode or you're in an innovation mode, is fundamental to being able to get the right process for the job.
I was on mute there. And in the context of a Progressly type environment, I'm guessing that a lot of the things that we're doing, we're talking about fault tolerant rather than foolproof, for example. Yet you might be talking about changes that are going to that are going to be deployed in the operational environment, where actually the foolproof, the governance, the checking that this is the right way to do things needs to happen, and you might be supporting that with processes and ways of engaging with your colleagues around those sorts of problems. Right? They're subtle, but it makes a big difference from the way in which you're going to build and develop and deploy these sorts of democratized processes that we were touching on just now. Nick, do you have something on that one that you want to touch on?
Yeah, I'd quibble with that a bit, just based on kind of how we think about driving the narrative originally. So I think Adam totally nailed it in terms of how to think about the difference between fault tolerant or foolproof. But it really starts with the overall initiative and agenda that that the line of business ultimately wants to set based on how they think about success. And a good example on Foolproof, Derek, for us is digitizing anything that's done that's safety-based today. There's a huge problem tied to how do you collect that data so that you can ensure that the safety framework that you have from an operational perspective is completely foolproof. So I think in safety, that's obviously goal zero if you think about a company like Shell, and Progressly supports that agenda by thinking about real-time data collection and visibility tied to what's getting submitted across a global network. So, more often than not, I think the agenda is fault tolerant when you think about how we're supporting different lines of business, but there are definitely several examples that I think are highest priority in this industry and others where foolproof might be the goal.
Again,
Yeah,
sorry.
The Progressly platform that I've interacted with, I think, has the ability to provide solutions in both modes of operation. You need to make sure you get your governance structure right, and to make sure you get your permissions set up correctly. But at the end of the day, I think the technology solution Progressly offers has equally beneficial applications in fault-tolerant type environments as in foolproof.
Okay, we've taken quite a bit of time on some of the earlier slides, so we're getting a little bit squeezed here because we want to leave a bit of time for Q&A. Eric, do you have a final thought on anything on the slide?
No, I think it's good to move on.
Okay. I mean, in a way, we wanted to leave you folks with a few key takeaways and then go to, leave 5 or 10 minutes for a Q&A, and we're almost on that point. Adam, you had a strong belief about this link to business strategy. I suppose I'm just going to try and wrap up and move us on. For me, it's about identifying these key questions that are here. That focusing on these capabilities. So, as I was saying, Adam, one of the questions that we've had come in. When you're trying to handle a problem, make an improvement, change the culture, or implement a key strategy, where do you go first? To manage the people or manage the process? Which one?
Well, for me, at the heart of everything is people. I think I mentioned it several times. People deliver, not process, but they need to be supported by the process. So I think it's very important to have a high degree of empathy whenever you're doing one of these type of changes. Keeping the people front and center of mind about what the impact will be on them. But then you can also use the process change or maybe a system introduction as a catalyst for a business improvement. So I would always keep people within the context of the business strategy as the starting point. Be very empathetic of their needs. Now, I don't always agree that the people will design or come up with the best process that suits them, but provided you have a customer-centric way of designing things, IDEO is famous for that in the Valley, but I think the same approach can be applied to any process change, and that is very people-centric.
Nick, just picking up on the discussion here about OPM and where that's going, and obviously I've got views here, but how do you see that trend moving forward for OPM versus the BPM or business process management more generally?
Yeah, absolutely. So BPM as well, I think, is a category that has been around for a while, but it kind of falls into a lot of the same traps that we've talked about here throughout the agenda. And I think the evolution, if you think about it, was business process management is something that requires a technical skill set. You to implement an on-premise database, and then you can actually automate the work through IT partners to get it done predictably. The next wave of that became enterprise collaboration, right? And there's an enterprise content management piece to that, but think tools like Yammer that was eventually acquired by Microsoft, where it's just get people talking, right? And if you can get people talking, then you might be able to get them to talk about work-related things. And I think the pendulum has kind of swung both ways there, right? BPM is something that was too rigid and technical. Enterprise collaboration was something that was too free-form and didn't help people do their job. And we really see OPM as the compromise between things that are going to be people-centric, and couldn't agree with Adam more. You have to start with people, because if you don't start with people, there's going to be no pattern change. There's going to be no commitment to the solution that you have in place. And that enables us to make it so that processes provide transparency across the business. And data is something that really just empowers decision making, right? So when we think about insights and intelligence, we want that all the way up to the executive level of the business, which can be an operational excellence or continuous innovation unit, or all the way tied to the CEO of the business, down to the people who are doing their job on the day-to-day basis. If something happens, that data can help them to make better decisions and do their job more productively.
Okay, so folks, I suppose we are in a way at the sort of Q&A bit here. I just want to see if there are any other questions coming from out there before we close this session. I've got one sort of final question away for Eric, and Eric, it's a sort of adaptation of where we were discussing earlier on, but what, in your experience, you're very experienced in the oil and gas industry. What do you think are the real advantages for oil and gas organizations, particularly in adopting these sorts of solutions? And by that I mean process support delivered either in the cloud or on-premise. It's not so relevant, but it's this sort of collaboration and this adaptive collaboration environments that we get with process flavor to it. Do you see any strong advantages, particularly for oil and gas, and maybe the role of knowledge workers within that?
I think we've touched in the previous discussions on a lot of needs that this industry was facing. So I think any solution that can meet these needs while simplifying the implementation and the usage, if you want, and also that can deliver the service across the organization or even beyond the organization, that is contractors, suppliers, is going to add a huge value. And I think the case can be made that Progressly has an interesting approach to it. Then obviously, depending on the companies, depending on their breadth, depending on their infrastructure, some of them will be tempted by a hosted solution, others by a private cloud. I think what's important here is to keep it light, to keep it quick, and to keep it available to as many people as possible, which all goes into if you want, a direction that we've seen in IT these last 5-10 years, but it's still fairly new in information technology, and it's very exciting.
Nick, any closing thoughts that you want to add to where we're at just before we go, or any other questions?
Sure. So I think we've talked about several things kind of tied to some of the industry trends that we're seeing, where Eric and Adam obviously had really good insight there. And I think one of the big things tied to innovation is that timing is going to be so important. And I think based on what 2016 looked like for the industry and how progressive we're seeing some of the IT leaders within a lot of our customers get when they think about hosted solutions, mobile and offline, I think what we've really been excited about is the fact that what would have been thought of as 4 separate initiatives, where you have cloud, you have mobile, you have offline, as 3 independent ones, we're now actually seeing that this notion of citizen development in OPM is something where if we can unify 4 kinds of initiatives that would have taken a year each individually, that kind of technological innovation is going to make it so that this industry and other industries that are thinking about digital transformation and tools that empower the line of business are going to be in a phenomenally opportunistic and defensible position towards the end of this year and over the next several years. So it's great, and I want to say thanks to Adam and Eric for sharing their thoughts. And overall, just really excited about the timing of this, tied to a lot of the things that we covered today.
Thanks very much for that, Nick. Just to let everybody know, first of all, thank you for attending the webinar. Just to let you know that the slides and the recording of this will be sent to all people who attended, and that'll be coming to you shortly. So I think on that note, we're at the top of the hour, so running out of time here. thank you, folks, for your time, and I'll hand it back to April and Sharon and the team to close us down. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.